in the fiscal year ending in June, 5.5 million taxpayers submitted returns, whereas Kenyans aged 18 and above, numbering 25.64 million, failed to file in their tax returns, according to government figures. And now, the Kenya Revenue Authority is seeking amendment bill creating Kenya's social security number called Huduma Namba. The bill stipulates that Huduma Namba assigned to an individual under the Huduma Act 2021 shall act as PIN for the purpose of tax legislation. Members of Parliament have suggested more amendments to the Huduma Namba biometric identification program, which would replace the KRA PIN in legislative revisions aimed at catching tax cheaters. The amendments will allow the KRA to access fundamental data such as a resident's personal data, biometric data, and biographical data in order to verify the individual's identification. KRA requested that the Committee on Administration and National Security of the National Assembly reconsider Section 5, subsection 1(3)(c), that in order for the National Integrated Identity Management System database to support the issuing of functional administrative information identifiers. Well, today we will be looking at how Kenya is going after tax cheats and if KRA's latest move is the most ingenious way of doing so. This is Business Edge. I am Lekan Onobanjo, standing in for Tolulope Adelero Balogun. And joining me from here in Nairobi, Kenya, is Ken Gichinga, Chief Economist, Mentoria Economics. You are welcome, Ken from Kenya. Thanks for joining us on Business Edge. Even as we continue with the show, but then do not forget what we are discussing this morning is about Kenya going after tax cheats. And we are trying to see if what KRA is proposing to the members of parliament, if that will sail through, and what they are asking for is access to data information and, of course, personal records of those who are evading the payment of tax in Kenya. So we'll just quickly run off on this break, and when we return, we'll try to see how we get to bring Ken back. Okay, so I'm made to understand that Ken is now with us on the show. So hello, Ken. Thanks for joining us on Business Edge.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start the discussion proper. What areas is Kenya currently earning money from when you talk about taxation? Which other areas do you think they will be considering in the near future?
Many thanks. If you look at the Kenyan taxation system, it has largely been focusing on the income tax, VAT. Those tend to be sort of like the more popular areas, as well as corporate tax. The feeling is, according to KRA, is only about 5.5 million Kenyans file their tax returns, while statistics show that there's about 25.6 million Kenyans above the age of 18. So this is part of a wider strategy to widen the tax base and to be able to fill in those coffers a bit more, a bit faster than normal.
Now, the Kenya Revenue Authority is asking the Parliament to give them access in the form of amending the Huduma Namba Bill. And this will actually give them access to personal data records of Kenyans, most especially those who are said to be evading tax. This will help them apprehend tax cheaters. Now, how feasible do you think this particular move will go, most especially looking at the fact that the Huduma Namba digital identification scheme has created a whole lot of controversy in time past, being a replacement for the current national identity card?
Well, it will be a challenge. Definitely, the matter has gone to court. The very nature of the Huduma number and how the data was collected has been the subject of a court case, and some elements of it are actually considered to be unconstitutional when you look at privacy, issues of personal data. So that will definitely be a barrier towards this sort of implementation. One gets the sense that Kenya is borrowing heavily from the US model, possibly through the IMF, where you have in the US, you have the social security number, which is sort of like the anchor pin for taxation. And the Huduma number will be applied to that. So there will be definitely some constitutional questions on data and privacy, but I do expect the KRA will possibly push for the case of that the country needs more revenue and far too many people sort of like escaping the tax net. So it will definitely be a matter that by no means will be highly debatable as we move forward.
Okay, so Ken, tell us, how deep-rooted is tax evasion in Kenya, and does that actually validate KRA's demand?
Well, I think the challenge has been when you think about how tax should be raised. And here in Kenya, there has been calls for a tax policy, and a tax policy that really looks at taxation in the proper economic sense. Tax should be easy, should be efficiently collected, should be proportionate and just. When you look at the Kenyan taxation system, particularly in a country in Africa where you have the vast segment of the economy is in the informal sector, for KRA it's been difficult to be able to get that 1,000 shillings from the roadside seller, because the cost of collecting that would be quite expensive. So I do expect this is sort of coming from that thinking that in a highly informal sector, collecting taxes from the masses is very difficult. And this Huduma number is a way of formalizing everybody, if you like. It actually formalizes the whole economy because everybody becomes part of the tax sector. And from this, I think KRA believes they can use technology to be able to broaden that tax base.
Earlier on, Ken, you talked about privacy, and a whole lot of Kenyans are worried about privacy breach. And of course, the taxman wants the proposed law to include access to data that is beyond acquisition of legal information like identity cards and, of course, information as regards passports. Now, don't you think that is a bit going too far when you talk about a violation of privacy? And how do we even trust the fact that this data, if KRA has access to it, will not be compromised for illicit use?
Absolutely right. And that has been the concern, particularly here in Nairobi. KRA says they want access to what they call foundational data. So this is access to biographical data, access to biometric data. And this is for everybody above 18 years old. Now, when you look at the typical profile of an 18-year-old in Kenya, they typically tend to be unemployed. They're probably preparing for college or for university. Possibly the only income comes from either government scholarship or parental assistance. And one would wonder why the government would be overzealous in trying to acquire this kind of data. So there is concern that that data might go well beyond tax purposes, that actually it might create security and privacy breaches. So many lawyers have gone to court, and the court has agreed with some of the legal debates there around that. So I think the government will have to make a case on the security in place. Is it really proportionate trying to get that much data from a segment that A, is jobless, and B, doesn't have much income? Those will be sort of like the caveats upon which this debate will evolve around.
So then, if the parliament goes ahead to ratify the demand of KRA in granting them access to personal records and data, that is the amendment of the Huduma number. Now, for them to actually determine citizens who are not paying tax, how efficient do you think this process will go in apprehending tax cheaters?
I mean, it will be very efficient in the sense that everybody will be part of the system. So with one data search, you'll be able to collect data. I think the benefits, because this policy has benefits and has risks. I think the benefits of it will be the data capture, because you'll quickly be able to tell who is unemployed, who is employed, because those are statistics that have been very difficult to get here in Kenya, quality unemployment statistics. So it will be very quick. At the click of a button, you'll be able to say the unemployment rate in Kenya is X percent, which has not been the case, and which is actually good for monetary policy in terms of understanding how much liquidity in the system. That said, the flip side to it again will create these huge risks on huge personal information on government servers, and the idea that people might have their personal data in areas where that are way beyond for tax purposes. I think that's what's causing a lot of discomfort, because now it creates massive security issues and massive privacy issues.
If I may ask, Ken, do you think that citizens of Kenya would embrace this new approach that KRA is bringing on board? Do you think there's a possibility they might want to revolt or stage a protest, so to speak? Or do you think it's something they would have to embrace whether or not they like what would come at the end of the demand made by KRA?
Well, I think it will be a spectrum. You'll have those in the corporate space, possibly who've already been paying taxes, saying, life goes on normal. But there'll definitely be a spectrum. Part of the spectrum will be people who will have to be sort of forced in, kicking and screaming. So it's going to be definitely a spectrum. But I do believe what it will do is, particularly for the younger generation who are largely unemployed, largely have no income, and possibly the only interaction with tax is VAT when they buy things like airtime or household goods. I think for that segment, there'll be quite a bit of awakening, because they will be able to understand what their tax obligation is, and they will ask whether they get the service delivery that is commensurate with that tax obligation. And if the answer is no, there could be quite a bit of unrest, which might actually play out on the political side. So this is, there are many layers to this onion, and depending on how it's played out, the PR around it, because mind you, Kenyans lined up quite a bit to get the Huduma Namba card. But even then, that was after some coercion, when they were told at some point you might not be able to access M-Pesa. So the tool to get Kenyans into these things typically has been more of coercion than persuasion. And definitely there will be a bit of resistance to this.
Well, no doubt, Ken, there are many shades to this new development that's coming up in Kenya. But then you just get to stay with us for a while. When we return, we get to ask you if there are other areas the Kenyan government can employ or look towards in terms of generating revenue for its economy. But then you can just stay with us and we'll be with you in a bit. Now, the Kenya Revenue Authority wants Parliament to amend the government-backed Huduma Namba Bill 2021, which amends the Tax Procedure Act to make biometric ID the key number for identifying taxpayers. Now, as they hope to gain unrestrained access to personal records, should the focus be more on individuals or corporate institutions that earn more but file less, if they even have any sort of filing of returns in the first place? But then we get to go on a break right now. When we return, we get to engage Ken more at the other side of this break. Do stay with us. Well, still with me on Business Edge is Ken Gichinga, a chief economist at Mentoria Economics, and we have been conversing on the new proposal by Kenya Revenue Authority to enable it apprehend tax cheats in the country. So back to you, Ken. Now, an estimated 30% of Kenyans pay personal income tax, while the corporate tax rate in the country is same number, 30%. So as KRA is trying to clamp down on tax evaders, which category do you think should be more important in terms of focus? Would you say the individuals, or would you say the corporate institutions in the country?
Actually, I'd say none of those. I think the big elephant in the room has been around the land rates. If you look at every major economy, it's definitely driven by property rates, and land rates tend to be the key driver for socioeconomic transformation. But when you look at land rates here in Nairobi, they are paid anchored on values that are almost 40 years out of date. Here in Nairobi, the valuation roll was last done in 1980. So people are paying paltry amounts of land rates, and that is the most legitimate area in terms of getting revenue for the coffers. Now, without that revenue, what ends up happening is now government has to look in other areas. Now, this is by harassing individuals, harassing small businesses, corporates. But if we do fix that issue, if we do digitize our lands registries, that is where really the revenue should be coming from. And it shocks me that if you look at the lands digitization program, it's been going on for the last 10 years, but still it's not yet complete. But if you look at how the Huduma Namba has been done so quickly, registering Kenyans, it's been done the last 2-3 years with huge efficiency. So it tells me we are putting the efficiencies in the wrong areas. We need to first digitize our land records, make sure that our land rates are proper. This can really get enough money for the counties and for the country. Then now we can be able to top up with either corporate income tax or personal income taxes.
Well, that's one area that you just mentioned, land rates, and I want to believe that the Kenyan government and its handlers in government would listen to this particular area that you've mentioned and see how they can generate income from that area. Now, there has been issues and conversations surrounding multiple taxation and excessive taxes being paid by Kenyans. Now, tell us, how has KRA addressed this issue over time? Because what we're looking at is having businesses who wouldn't be stifled, who would be choked, and of course that will eventually lead to loss of revenue.
Well, there has been some cosmetic changes. One of the recommendations in the last finance bill is to even change the name of the Kenya Revenue Authority to become the Kenya Revenue Service, a service that is friendly, a service that has customer service, and that seems to be the image that is being pushed. But when you scratch the surface, the policy change hasn't fundamentally changed. If you look at our public debt, which has been rising, it forces the KRA to have to be able to collect even more revenue. Because as we speak about, for every 100 shillings that is collected, about 65 shillings is going towards servicing our public debt. So this is not even about service delivery. This is raising revenue so that we can service our public debt. And that's what irks a lot of people, that are paying, but they're not receiving the service delivery. So I think it paints a negative picture of our fiscal policy that is continuously being debt-driven. And because of that debt-driven, now you have to raise taxes in areas that touch sometimes the poorest of the poor. In the latest finance bill, they're talking of VAT on wheat flour. If you look at our fuel, 46% of our fuel is tax. When you look at our foods, most food items, really there's tax on those food items. We find the cost of living goes up, people's lives become more impossible. And all this is not because for service delivery, but to be able to sort of like service this humongous public debt. So there is a call to action in terms of how we think about our fiscal policy, because if we continue at this particular rate, we'll be asking a lot more from Kenyans, but giving them a lot less.
Now, Ken, we are aware that in September 2021, there was a law, a court actually suspended a law that allowed the government to collect taxes on businesses that actually declare losses or falls outside the tax bracket. Now, how do you think KSA would ensure that the law that it is planning to enact and re-amend would not run foul of this particular law?
Well, in that particular ruling, the argument that was put in place was that businesses were cooking their books, that in as much as they were making real profit, they were cooking their books to show they were making losses, and therefore they were sort of like us presenting a nil returns, what they call nil returns, and the government felt it's losing quite a bit of revenue. But if that was happening, I would imagine it was at a small scale. It's hard to imagine that there was this grand plan of cooking books. So I think what the government should have done then is to be able to ask the audit books for these companies and query the auditors or ask for audited statements, but really making businesses that genuinely make losses, because the cost of doing business in Kenya is quite high. So the probability of you making a loss is quite high. Okay. But asking those people to continue paying taxes actually, it seemed somewhat unjust.
Okay, so finally, Ken, governments across Africa are trying innovative ways to collect tax and generate revenue. In Nigeria, public agencies are said to have evolved certain ways by the way of technology, to collect tax without having to multiple tax businesses, so to speak. Even in Ghana, there's this e-levy scheme that is in place. So basically, asking you, Ken, are there other ways that you think Kenyan government can employ? Are there some technology-enabled means by which Kenyan government can use to collect taxes and generate income without having to breach personal records and data, and of course without having to choke businesses?
Well, there are definitely a lot of technologies that are coming up, whether it's in the blockchain space, whether it's in mobile money, whether it's in the digital service tax, looking at the digital economy. But the gap has not been on the technology. I think the gap has been on the principles. What are the principles of taxation? Once you have the principles right, then the avenues, whether it's digital or manual, really don't matter. And I think that's where it's been lacking in terms of the principles. And I think Adam Smith put it very clearly in terms of the principles of taxation. It should be proportionate. So you need to have taxes that are not on the consumption side, but on the production side. We need to start making the distinction between progressive taxes and regressive taxes. Consumption taxes like VAT, those tend to be quite regressive. What we want to move to is towards more progressive taxes, whether it's your land rates, whether it's your corporate tax. These tend to be more on the production side, so that the more money you make, the more money you pay, which seems very proportionate. Consumption taxes tend to work in reverse in terms of, the higher the VAT, the less you consume. So I think it's the principles, and I think it's economics behind it. Once we have the principles, and that's why we've been calling for national tax policy. Once we have that right, then it's so much easier to be able now to understand what would be the adequate technologies to be able to collect these taxes, and they should be quite simple too.
Thank you so much, Ken Gichinga, for joining us on Business Edge. Really appreciate your presence.
Thank you for having me.
Well, if the MPs accede to KRA's demand, the Huduma Namba card ID holders will automatically be listed as taxpayers once they attain the age of 18 and be required to pay taxes. Consequently, all adults will be required to register with the KRA, offering the taxman a larger pool of people than the 5.5 million that has been netted through the returns. So in the coming days or weeks, we await what the Parliament stance would be, and be sure that we will update you on that. Let's quickly go for a break, and when we return, we'll bring you NC4 to watch. Do stay with us. So let's quickly take you through the 4 top trending stories in the business world. And we start with Google. Now, Google has opened a product development center in Nairobi. It's first in the continent, seeking to build products and services for the African market and also the whole world. The center is Google's second major research and development investment in Africa after setting up an AI and research center in Ghana in 2019. And away from that, Uganda has asked Kenya to allocate it a fixed monthly amount of fuel supply, seeking to alleviate shortages that have driven pump prices higher. Uganda wants 110,660 cubic meters of gasoline, 110,400 cubic meters of diesel, and 12,000 cubic meters of aviation fuel shipped through Kenya monthly to meet demand that's rebounded with the reopening of the economy after easing pandemic-related restrictions. Now, let's tell you that the International Monetary Fund has given Nigeria an upward review of its economic growth forecast for the year 2022, while expecting that the global output will decline due to the consequences of the crisis in Ukraine. Lender reduced expected global output to 2022 to 3.6% in April, down from 4.4% expected in January. These projections are worrisome since global output grew by 6.1% in 2021, a year haunted by the effects of the pandemic. And finally, the heads of the world's biggest international finance institutions sounded the alarm about record global debt levels, with the International Monetary Fund's chief saying options to deal with the billions owed by poor nations are disappearing. Both organizations have for months flagged risks from rising debt levels in emerging markets, particularly as interest rates start to increase to cool accelerating inflation. Now, the World Bank estimates that the poorest countries, whose fragile economies have been decimated by the pandemic, owe $35 billion in the payments in 2022. And that's it on Business Edge for today. Do not forget that you can visit our social media platforms at News Central TV and our website www.newscentral.africa. While also you can download our mobile app on App Store and Play Store and see the number of juicy stories that we have for you there. Until next time, I'm Lekan Onobanjo.